Wonderful. Our final speaker is Joseph Gerson. He is the Director of Programs and Director of the Peace and Economic Security Program of the American Friends Service Committee, otherwise known as the Quakers. And he's the Director of the Northeast region. He has written several books illustrating the deadly connection between nuclear weapons and foreign military interventions. I know Joe for a long time, having worked with him in anti-nuclear movements in the United States as well as internationally. So Joe has a different subject today, which is not directly related to the operational aspects of the nuclear weapons, but about international tensions, and it is really primarily a political weapon ultimately. So the technical issues are of course important, but we have to realize it is primarily a political weapon, and to fight nuclear weapons, we have to take up the political and social fight. Thank you.
All right. We're there, okay.
Great.
I'm the historian and organizer on this panel, and I have to say I sort of wish I was speaking after Max because my talk is not going to be quite as uplifting. My talk is going to kind of build in some ways from Elaine's and really in the tradition of Pogo. We've met the enemy and he's us. The reality is that I guess I'm going to point to some elements of the nature of our state, which may be a little bit unsettling. So to begin with, I worked fairly closely with Dan Ellsberg over the years. Dan was a nuclear senior nuclear policy advisor to Kennedy, Johnson, and briefly to Nixon. And he's taught us that the notion common to nearly all Americans that no nuclear weapons have been used since Nagasaki is mistaken. Again and again, generally in secret from the American public, the U.S. nuclear weapons have been used in precisely the same way that a gun is used when you point it at someone's head in a direct confrontation, whether or not you pull the trigger. This shouldn't surprise us. Reference was made earlier to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The reality, if you look at the Burns quote at the end, was that was principally an attack related to Russia. So the United States could bring the war to an immediate end, consolidate its control over northern China, Manchuria, and Korea, rather than let the Soviets do so. And one of the results coming out of that was also the belief among the senior figures of our elite that the weapons were useful, the weapon had succeeded, and they could build from there. Noam Chomsky, who teaches at this institution, essentially has taught us that we've used our nuclear weapons many, many times in ways that essentially prevent anyone from coming to defend those that we're determined to attack. So think here in terms of Panama, think here in terms of Vietnam, the long history that we'll kind of point to. I want to concede that there is and has been what we understand is the traditional way that deterrence works, mutual assured destruction. But the reality beneath that is that we've used our nuclear weapons in other ways. We have to kind of go at what deterrence theory is. First, what you have here is from the initial H.W. Bush nuclear doctrine, in which they said that the focus of U.S. deterrence efforts is to influence potential adversaries to withhold actions intended to impact U.S. national interests. The central focus being deterrence is for one nation to exert such influence over a potential adversary's decision process that the potential adversary makes a deliberate choice to refrain from a course of action. Not to necessarily to prevent them from launching their nuclear weapons, but that they should not take a course of action that in some way impinges on U.S. global influence and power. More recently, we have a statement from just last month saying that the value of the bomber force is sending political signals as clear and convincing, which is to say that we repeatedly use our nuclear-capable bombers, and we're about to build a whole new generation, in order to threaten to initiate nuclear war. It's at the core of our policy. Time means I'll keep going. We've heard throughout the morning about the dangers of nuclear war. They're real and increasing. Adding to the list that we have heard already, there's the possibility of insubordination at different levels of the military, and you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, we can go into that in some detail. We have to now fear about the possibility of cyber hacking into our nuclear missile sites. Terrorism, we've been hearing about that all week, but to also think in terms of who's under our drones, or what happens when we're threatening other countries with first-strike nuclear attack. Is that terrorism? What happened in Hiroshima? Was that terrorism? And then we also have the possibilities of the failure of deterrence. Reference was made to the development of a new generation of nuclear weapons, and they're being designed to be quote-unquote more usable. I can't go into this history in great depth, but this is simply a history of U.S. first-strike preparations and threats in order to maintain U.S. hegemony in the oil-rich Middle East. Note here that it began in 1946 in a crisis over Iran, when the Soviet Union did not have nuclear weapons. 1973 was really what pushed me into this, when Nixon and Kissinger essentially allowed Golda Meir to surround and threaten the total destruction of the Egyptian Third Army after there was already a ceasefire. Sadat called for the United States and Russia to intervene. The United States was not happy about that, and so moved to a massive nuclear alert in the last days of the Watergate crisis. And we can go into more detail on any of those. Surprisingly, at least to me, as I began researching this, was the number of threats in relationship to maintaining U.S. dominance in Asia Pacific, beginning in 1950 with the outbreak of the Korean War. Eisenhower's reelection was in part based on his commitment to bring that war to an end, and he threatened nuclear attack to move from what was a functional ceasefire to an armistice. And it was learning at Eisenhower's knee that Nixon in turn learned what he called the madman theory, which he then implemented during the Vietnam War. The accidents on the DMZ in Korea, absolutely chilling, to the point that the U.S. senior commander in South Korea thought that the war and nuclear attacks, the U.S. use of nuclear attacks, were absolutely imminent, and asked for authority to launch U.S. nuclear weapons without having to hear from Washington. And of course, these dangers didn't end with the Cold War. We have repeatedly done simulated nuclear attacks against North Korea. And if you look at the number of times the United States has prepared and threatened to initiate a nuclear war against North Korea, plus the history of having destroyed about 99% of all buildings in North Korea during the Korean War, you can understand why the North Koreans might have moved as they have. I'm seeing a time thing, which is not happy. So then a long history here of post-Cold War nuclear threats, beginning with the 1991 war. And of course, we had mentioned earlier the increased dangers with Russia, initially in relationship to Ukraine and then also Syria. Of course, the United States is not the only nation that's done this. This is a summary history of other countries who have prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war during wars and international crises. I want to point to some of the lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis. First, we learned that political forces within a country can drive political leaders to do the irrational. John Kennedy turned to Bobby at one point and said, look, if I hadn't responded as I had, I would have been impeached. And we need to remember, for example, what happened in China after the Japanese moved to nationalize the Senkaku Dayu Islands. Massive riots, repression, and the government feeling it had to kind of let things go wild for a while. There's the danger of strange Lovian military insubordination. We had, in the middle of that crisis, on the one hand, senior generals upping the level of the DEFCON alert without authorization, at a time when Kennedy wanted quiet in the Caribbean so Khrushchev could consider one of his proposals. Didn't want any attacks on Soviet submarines. It was the best time for our troops, our Navy, to practice depth charging of submarines, and we came within moments of the end. We've heard before here about the B-61-12. Cartwright saying, if we can drive down the yield, it becomes more usable. Once they're used, what do you think the response of the so-called enemy is going to be? We also have another one with the air-launched cruise missile. I'm sure we'll hear about that this afternoon. And then I think we need to look at some of the deeper levels of the United States and Russia. The United States has, in violation of the commitment made to Gorbachev, expanded NATO to Russia's borders. The Russians can't help but remember Napoleon coming from the West, the Kaiser coming from the West, Hitler coming from the West. We heard before about the levels of fear in Russia, and this is what's driving them, plus their conventional inferiority, driving them to become increasingly reliant. So if we want to get to the build down, we're going to need to deal with some of the other dimensions that are driving the arms race. Similarly, we have real challenges in relationship to China. This is a photograph I picked up off of a presentation at Harvard. What you see here are Japanese and Chinese warships, Taiwanese fishing trawlers. The likelihood of an incident spinning out of control, and the Chinese have told us this many times, is extremely frightening, because when you get the political factors that come in behind it, it's the kind of thing that can drive to the ultimate. Then here on the subject of hope and fear, we have Ted Cruz, who's telling us that he would make the desert glow. And then the question is, do you have confidence in Trump, who initially in one of the debates didn't even know what the triad was, and now tells us he won't take any of the cards off the table. We've got Putin on the other side, who's telling us that he seriously considered the use of nuclear weapons, if necessary, to defend the control of Crimea. Almost done. Hillary tells us, on the one hand, she was right there with all options on the table in relationship to Iran, and she tells us that nuclear weapons will be abolished in some century. What drives the global arms race? Well, Mohammed al-Baradi, and if you go to any of the international conferences like the one Ira was talking about earlier, what you hear is there's a double standard. The United States can threaten annihilation of all these other countries, but they can't. And deep, deep anger and rage on this last slide here, no, second last slide. Joseph Rotblat, the one senior scientist in the Manhattan Project who quit over moral considerations, has told us very clearly that humanity faces a stark choice. We either completely eliminate them, or they will be used to our detriment, to say the least. Reference was made earlier to Article 6. And finally, two books that you might find helpful in going deeper into this are my book, and then Nixon's Nuclear Spectre just came out about 10 days ago. And I think it's a very important book and well worth a read.
Thank you, Joe.